AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, today we are joined by Max Nesterak, who is the deputy editor of the Minnesota Reformer, who reports on labor and housing, as we're going to be talking about some of the labor news that he has been working on, including an update on the Minneapolis Police Union contract, which we chatted about with Max the last time we had him on. We'll also be talking about how Amazon's Shakopee facility may have been violating some of Minnesota's warehouse worker safety laws. Plus, we'll be talking about this case that has to do with a company called Environmental Stoneworks and some potential violations they've had with mistreating Latino workers as compared to white workers. So lots to get to today. Max, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking about Environmental Stoneworks. So Latino workers for a subsidiary of the largest manufacturer of exterior building products in North America say they were paid less than white workers because they were immigrants, and allege that Environmental Stoneworks, the company we're talking about, had misclassified scores of workers to avoid paying overtime, among other benefits. And many projects the company has worked on have received significant tax breaks as well. So Max, let's talk a little bit about some of these specific disparities in treatment and pay between Latino workers and their white counterparts, as reported by Angel Torres and some other workers at this company. Let's talk about how they say they're being mistreated as compared to their white counterparts.
Sure, yeah. So, one worker worked in Environmental Stoneworks' factory in North Branch, which makes these stone brick veneer facades. The company also installs them. So there's kind of two aspects to this company. It's vertically integrated. And so one worker who worked in the factory for nearly 15 years said he noticed disparities in pay between immigrant Latino workers and their white counterparts, just because, people talk about their pay with each other. He's been there a long time. He rose to be a foreman. And so he said that not only were white workers paid a couple dollars more per hour than non-white workers, but they also got more breaks. And he said when he raised this issue with his boss told him that Americans were not used to working as hard as Latinos. And so he continued to raise, he says, issues, concerns about this disparate treatment, and ultimately he was let go in December. He thinks because of him speaking out about this, and so he was let go, and then he said other workers kind of staged a strike, a protest because of his termination, and then when they did return to work, they were let go. And he said because those workers were told, because they found out some of them were undocumented. He says, the company knew that many of them were undocumented before them. So retaliation on top of retaliation by his account.
I want to bring this up, too, because nearly a quarter of construction workers in Minnesota, which is about 30,000 people, are misclassified or paid off the books. And as we kind of talked about in this case, it's really hard to have any sort of recourse to try to report these violations other than, talking to your union, or in this case, going to the media and trying to get support with what's happening, because there are a lot of challenges that these workers face when trying to report some of these issues with management. Can you talk about that aspect as well?
Yeah, so, misclassification, if you talk to worker advocates and labor unions, is just rampant in the non-union construction industry. And misclassification happens when employers call workers independent contractors rather than employees. If you're an employee, you're entitled to all sorts of protections and benefits, from a minimum wage to overtime to workers' compensation insurance to unemployment insurance. And what we see in the construction industry is often a fissured and layered system where there's a general contractor who hires contractors, who hires subcontractors, who hires other subcontractors, who hires workers who may call each individual worker a subcontractor. And so the workers actually swinging the hammers and hanging the drywall don't have protections in the event of injuries, while the companies save money on not having to pay taxes and insurance premiums. So one worker said he knew someone who was injured on the job and struggled to get compensation for that injury. So it's a large issue, and it's something that the state has tried to go after more in recent years. So this year, the legislature passed a law that increases the penalties just for misclassification, and also streamlines the tests used to determine if someone is an independent contractor, to make it a little bit easier to for workers to assert their rights.
So could some of those new laws that were passed by the legislature impact the situations that we're seeing right now with environmental stoneworks? I'm curious if potentially these workers could see some contribute or get compensated for some of the pay they may have missed, or could get remedied for the situations they ran into from some of these new laws that were passed by the state legislature.
Yeah, that's a good question. The union LIUNA, Minnesota, North Dakota, which represents more than 13,000 construction workers, has helped advocate for these workers, and they say that the Department of Labor and Industry, as well as the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, have received complaints from these workers about misclassification, wage theft, and racial discrimination. So it's possible that either of those agencies, through their efforts, could recover back wages if they determine that what the workers allege has happened is indeed what happened. So that remains to be seen. Another law that the legislature passed is it requires apartment buildings that receive state subsidies or low-income housing tax credits to be built, that they have a prevailing wage. And I don't think that would apply in this situation, because it took effect. It depends on when you applied for funding, and I'm assuming this project applied for that LIHTC credit before this law took effect. But even so, news conference last week with Democratic lawmakers, union officials, and workers who say they were mistreated, they, just again called out that the state should not be providing tax subsidies to contractors who use employers with checkered paths of labor violations. So lawmakers and the union say Environmental Stoneworks is one of the worst actors, known to misclassify workers and not pay overtime, especially to immigrant workers. However, I did check with the Department of Labor and Industry to see what past violations do you have for Environmental Stoneworks or its parent company, and I was told they didn't have anything on file. So it doesn't appear to me that state regulators have actually cited Environmental Stoneworks for labor violations, at least in recent years.
We can read more about what's happening with Environmental Stoneworks and some of these violations that have been alleged against them with how they treat Latino workers versus white workers over at MinnesotaReformer.com. That's MinnesotaReformer.com. And sticking on the topic of labor violations with big companies, we're going to talk about Amazon now, because Amazon's Shakopee facility is facing over a $10,000 fine for alleged worker safety standards. Now, this is something you guys reported on at the Minnesota Reformer last fall about these violations with potential worker warehouse safety law violations that were recently passed. So I'm curious, just to back up, what were some of these violations? Because it sounds like a big part of this was a lack of communication from Amazon to their workers about, for instance, what was on their work quota versus what workers were allowed to do when it came to breaks and other aspects of their job, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So there were two citations from the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry through its Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And I should note right off the bat that Amazon is appealing these citations and contests them. They're both, one is for alleged worker safety hazards, specifically ergonomic safety hazards, and the other is for not telling workers what quota they're being held to as required under a new warehouse worker safety bill passed by lawmakers last year. So just to dig into the first one about workplace worker safety hazards, it's a little bit light on details in terms of the citation, but the agency says that the company did not do a good enough job making sure that workers are safe from, repetitive stress injuries through their work, which is really common in warehouses, especially Amazon warehouses, where you're lifting boxes, picking, sorting items, walking miles across hard concrete floors. There's surveys that show, lots of workers have to take days off for injuries or just being exhausted from the work. And the second citation about not telling workers their quota, lawmakers passed this last year with the rationale that if workers are being, if their productivity is being monitored and they're being held to a standard, they need to know what that standard is and they need to know what their data is. And this is really specific to Amazon in that we know Amazon tracks workers' movements down to the second, and they track when workers are having time off tasks. And so lawmakers wanted to protect against a work speed up where the quotas are set higher and higher and workers don't really know what they are, but just have to keep working faster and faster, which would lead to more injuries. Now, Amazon says that the citation fundamentally misunderstands how they set quotas. They say they don't have set quotas for workers. It sounds like it's kind of a moving target that couldn't be easily disclosed to workers. So I guess their defense is, we don't have a set quota, therefore we can't tell workers what it is. But it is clear that Amazon does have productivity goals for workers. So it remains to be seen how, let's say, agencies and perhaps the courts handle this issue. And I can just read the quote from the Amazon spokeswoman that says, quote, Amazon's employee performance guidance at our operations facilities is based on safe and achievable expectations that take into account employee time and tenure, peer performance, and safe work practices. So again, that reads to me like it's kind of a moving target that's different for each worker. But again, like if you think about the point of the law, which was to prevent a speed up and to give workers information to know what targets they're having to hit, I think, lawmakers say Amazon should be disclosing what that is.
I want to report on one other story from the break room, which, by the way, you can find every week on MinnesotaReformer.com with some of the latest news on labor news. I want to talk about the Minneapolis Police Union contract because this is an update to what we talked about a few weeks ago when we last spoke, and that is the new Minneapolis Police Union contract because currently the Minneapolis City Council has not committed to approving those 22% pay increases for police officers. And in fact, looking at some of these pay increases, starting pay for new officers in Minneapolis would be even higher than what you have in Los Angeles and New York. So just to back things up a little bit, let's talk about how supporters of this pay increase are justifying, why starting police officers should be getting this higher pay versus also, some of what critics are saying as to, why Minneapolis police officers shouldn't quite be seeing this steep of a pay increase. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think the main argument in support of these pay increases is that the department has dwindled down to just over 500 officers from its peak of about 900 since the police killing of George Floyd. And so proponents say, the only way we're going to be able to recruit more workers, more police officers, is by raising wages. So it's as simple as a supply and demand issue. You got to raise prices to get raise salaries to get more interest. Opponents say, they point to the department's many settlements for misconduct and the court-ordered, court-sanctioned monitoring for civil rights violations, and they see this as an unfair reward to a department that's poorly managing police misconduct, and say, why would we shower more resources on a department that is already bleeding the city dry by way of police misconduct settlements and PTSD claims. So that's where we're at, kind of like at a fever pitch disagreement over what police officers should make. And I think I may have told you last time that we expected it to go before the council quickly. Well, it actually was delayed until mid-July, as far as I know, to give the public more time to weigh in on this. It's hard to say what's going to happen. I mean, I think there's many on the council who are opposed to these raises, but it's going to be challenging also to reject it and go back to mediation. The city and the union have been trying to hammer out a deal for months and months now. So it's what that means if the council rejects it, and you have to go back to the drawing board. Now, I'll also mention that proponents, including Mayor Fry, has said that there is some police accountability aspects in here, including allowing the police chief to pay officers under investigation for serious misconduct on leave for up to 180 days. So give them some more wiggle room, but opponents say it's just not enough accountability.
And as you said, it sounds like we're going to have more hearings until about mid-July, so no decision will necessarily be made before then. But as we talked about, where you're kind of alluding to, this could create kind of a messy situation if the council does decide to reject this contract.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm just waiting to see what happens with that. My colleague Dina Winter has been all over it, covering this story, and she'll be continuing to report on it.
So make sure you follow along, MinnesotaReformer.com, and make sure you check out the break room over at MinnesotaReformer.com, a good wrap-up and kind of rundown of all of the labor news that's happening in Minnesota. Well, you have been speaking with Max Nesterak, who is the deputy editor of the Minnesota Reformer, who reports on labor and housing. Again, make sure you go to MinnesotaReformer.com. Max, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.